Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Ambassador Chas Freeman, former Assistant Secretary of Defense. So, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be with you, Glenn.
So, in the 1990s, you were involved in constructing the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe. In those days, you're likely working with Europeans such as Mitterrand or Chirac, Kohl, Schröder, Prodi, other statesmen who had rational discussions about European security. Well, they're gone, and a lot of the quality we had in European politics also appears to be gone. These days, European security, it doesn't really revolve around the idea of advancing indivisible security or mitigating security competition. Instead, it seems that the main objective is to advance the coalition of the willing to defeat Russia. I was wondering, what are your views on the direction of European politics these days? Because our governments hardly seem stable, and if we would take a step back, the Russian security concerns aren't that unreasonable, and they can be met in terms of not having hostile military infrastructure on its border. But what do you make of the coalition of the willing and this very limited and I would say very militaristic perspective on security?
Well, of course, European governments now are almost all unstable. We've just seen the fifth prime minister in France in 2 years, and a collapse of the Macron apparatus is going on. Germany has had to resort to a virtual ban on the Alternative für Deutschland in order to keep its politics going. And and we've just seen an election in Czechia with a very interesting result. So I think, oddly enough, most of Europe now resembles Italy in the bad old days when we had, a prime minister every week, a different one. But the main issue, I think, I could completely agree with you. There is no evidence at present of any European vision with regard to a whole series of issues. No plan for coexistence with Russia. No thinking, apparently, about the day after the war in Ukraine, which will end at some point, probably with a negotiation, which will not be favorable to Ukraine. No vision for transatlantic relations. Basically, sycophancy to President Trump is the substitute for a realistic dialogue. No concept of how to cope with a world in which the West is no longer the center, or to deal with the phenomenon of Chinese rise, economically and otherwise. I mean, China is now, in purchasing power terms, at least 1/3 larger than the American economy, maybe twice as large as the American economy. And it is the pace setter for growth in the global economy in the way that the United States used to be. But I don't see any evidence of European concepts to deal with this new reality. Europe has not come to grips with the changes in West Asia, including the genocide in Gaza. It has not redefined its relationship with Israel, except in very minor ways. It has allowed Israel to treat itself as an honorary outpost of European civilization, which I think it began as, but I don't think it shares the values of the Europeans anymore. Lots of issues. No vision for reorganizing the global institutions that we've depended upon, which are all in eclipse: the UN, the World Trade Organization, and associated bodies. So a lot of inertia, a lot of confusion, no clarity, no vision, no leadership. And Europe itself, you have a phenomenon. I was thinking today about the phenomenon of the Hungarian objection to Ukrainian membership, or at this point, accession negotiations with Ukraine for the EU. This is based on precisely the issue that triggered the civil strife in Ukraine in 2014, namely the linguistic and cultural rights of the 150,000 Ukrainians who are native speakers of Hungarian. It is because of this that Viktor Orban has vetoed any effort to begin an accession negotiation for the EU. And we have strange trends going on with the EU apparently trying to develop its own version of NATO as a parallel body. At least if I read what Ursula von der Leyen is saying, that seems to be the direction of her thinking at any rate. So you're right. This is a singularly unimpressive performance by leaders who are also unimpressive and don't have the support of their own people.
Yes, toward a new realities. It does appear at some level this is where the Europeans are struggling, that they are just hoping for the 1990s to come back. So in terms of the relationship with the US, just wait out Trump until someone like Biden or others come back. Russia can be defeated and the economy broken, so it can go back to managing its decline, or essential foreign policy depending on Russia doing what we wanted to do and put sanctions on Russia and on China, and lecture it a bit about human rights and keep the managed chaos going in the Middle East. But in terms of the relationship with the United States, do you again what one gets the impression from looking at Ukraine when there's, for example, when there was this call for an unconditional ceasefire, what all the European leaders were saying, tweeting pretty much the same message, was that the ball is in Russia's court. So the whole purpose of the peace suggestion, which was not really peace, but was to direct Trump's fury at Russia and hope that this will be something that can reunite us with the Americans. But what do you see in the future of Europe-America relations? As you said, the Europeans are developing an alternative to NATO. Do you think NATO can survive this, or has NATO had its day in the sun?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I thought in the 1990s, which I could think you're correct, people regard with nostalgia. The 1990s, actually, the Europeans very willingly, out of their own confusion, followed the U.S. lead on NATO developments, and I was involved with that, as you indicated. So the Partnership for Peace emerged as one of two possible things, either a path to the expansion of NATO, as people in the former Soviet colonies of Eastern Europe, now independent, conform their political structures and institutions in the defense area to those of Western Europe, namely parliamentary oversight of defense budgets, a high measure of transparency in military planning, and the civilian leadership of the military through the defense ministry. All of these traditions alien to the Soviet tradition, and also mastered the 3000 standardization agreements, or STANAGs, which allowed multinational forces to operate effectively as a whole. So Europeans, I think, quite eagerly responded to that American suggestion. There was American leadership, in other words, in the possible restructuring and revamping of NATO. The other possibility for the Partnership of Peace, of course, which turned out to be stillborn, was the idea of cooperative security in Europe, that NATO would extend to all countries with a plausible claim to be European, would have a consultative relationship with the Russians, and indeed we had a NATO-Russia Council in Brussels. Russian military officers were stationed there, and things looked to be moving in the right direction. A lot of things then went wrong, and I think the Europeans now are once again back where they were when the Cold War ended, and not sure what to do, not sure what role NATO has to play in all of this. I think NATO is an incredibly useful organization for the simple reason that it does provide a set of common standards and fora for joint military task forces and actions on the part of the transatlantic alliance. It could provide those things for Europeans alone. And in fact, I think it's not implausible to imagine that the Supreme Commander in NATO will be a European in the future, rather than an American, as the United States trims its commitments. I note that apparently the Pentagon is looking at a national defense strategy for the United States, which retreats pretty much to the Western Hemisphere, with the addition of opposing the rise of China, fecklessly, I should say, since China is going to rise regardless of what we do. It was the largest, best governed, most prosperous society on the planet for most of recorded history, and it's not strange that it is coming back after the 500-year interlude of Western dominance. But again, I say that, Europeans who once were the overlords of the entire world now don't seem to know how to deal with the world, how to deal with a world in which, as I said, the West is no longer the center. So a lot of almost Brownian motion in European politics at the moment.
Well, if let's say you would get a call from Washington, get your old position back as Assistant Secretary of Defense, what would be your recommendation, though? What can Europe do these days to reform the European security architecture and I guess get back on track? Because we does feel that some of the problems we had was the inability to, I guess, find a position for Russia at the seat of the table in Europe, because a lot was redivided, it seems. Well, the continent redivided, and instead of having a Cold War in the Third World for influence, it seemed that the new Cold War began with, redrawing the new dividing lines in Europe. And I think in very deeply divided societies, be it Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova, it becomes natural flashpoints where we will compete for influence. And in all of this competition, we ended up with not just war, but now economic problems, political, social. Of course, not everything goes back to the failure of having an inclusive security architecture, but I guess what is required besides, of course, learning how to live on the same continent with Russia? What else has to be done, you think?
Well, I should have mentioned, and you did peripherally mention the fact that Europe also doesn't know how to manage energy security anymore. That's something that as a Norwegian you probably think about from time to time. No, I think, well, of course, if I were to be called back, which is not going to happen, and I don't think I would want to at my age, those jobs in the Pentagon can be quite strenuous. If I were called back, I would be working for President Trump. And I think in a vague way, he's going in the right direction. That is, I don't believe that the United States needs to keep troops in Europe. I think that we can have a commitment to backstop Europeans through NATO that is managed in a sort of over-the-horizon manner with it exercises and prepositioned equipment and so forth. I don't believe that Europe should be divided between a Russian sphere and the rest. I don't worry very much, although I didn't hear President Putin's answer to your question about the Baltic states at Valdai. I don't worry very much about Russian predation in the Baltics. I don't think Russia feels very threatened by Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. And I think it considers those problems manageable. Of course, we could make them unmanageable if we overextend our military presence in them. I think Europe needs political solutions, not military solutions. It needs to have a mechanism for handling intra-European conflicts, which are not limited to those with Russia. If you look at the Balkans, for example, there are a lot of unfinished bits of business there. Kosovo is not recognized by most countries in the world as the independent entity that Europe and the United States pretend it is. The Serbs are not reconciled to the rest of Europe. There's always a problem between the Greeks and Turks. There are problems now between Hungarians and Ukrainians, assuming that Ukraine eventually finds its way into the European fold. That has to be dealt with. We dealt with those problems in the 90s as part of the European and Union and NATO accession processes. Various chunks of minority-inhabited land that had been claimed by Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and so on were straightened out. It was a requirement to get into NATO that you had to have no territorial disputes with your neighbors, which of course immediately disqualifies Ukraine. And not just on the grounds of Russian minority, but other minorities, including the Hungarians who we mentioned. So if I were asked, I would say the United States should discuss with Europeans a program of transition to a greater European role in self-defense, a lessened U.S. burden. I think President Trump actually wants that. And I would insist on a return to an active dialogue and interaction between Brussels and Moscow. I would hope that we could find an end to the war in Ukraine that preserves Ukraine sufficiently large and intact to be able to address its terrible problems, which begin with poverty and corruption, but extend to the embrace of a fascist ideology and banderism, if you will. So I would be thinking about a lot of these things, and I would not try to impose anything on Europe, which I think sometimes President Trump is tempted to do. I don't know if you've seen Jens Stoltenberg's discussion in The Guardian of how his first meeting with Trump went and how Trump almost walked out on NATO. But it's very interesting. There are better solutions which involve consultation and the development of a plan that involves transition in an orderly fashion toward a rearrangement of transatlantic responsibilities. Let me conclude by saying that I felt in 1993-94 when I synthesized various suggestions and that became the Partnership for Peace, that the United States had to have a continuing role in Europe for the simple reason that Europe and the United States, Canada, North America, if you will, are part of the same geostrategic zone. And the United States has a legitimate interest in how Europeans manage their problems and a legitimate interest in ensuring that they do manage their problems rather than allow their problems to erupt into conflict and warfare. So that's a long answer, but my basic point of view is that there does seem to be a rebalancing of the relationship.
Yeah, well, this is well, that's why I was also curious about the U.S. position here, because I hear it's being interpreted in very different ways. Some people see the United States as simply wanting a bit of a new division of labor, that Europeans take over the containment of Russia. Others suggest that Trump just wants to get out of NATO altogether and well, stop focusing on Europe. At least for the Europeans, though, it's been I think the hope was that the Ukraine war would be something that would reunite us with the US. This was almost the celebratory statement in 2022 that, well, if Russia didn't want NATO, then this has now strengthened NATO for decades to come. And instead, it seems to be leading to severe weakening, to the point when you said Trump was considering just walking away from NATO altogether. But what is the new objective of the US? Is it just to have the Europeans take over the proxy war before it all falls apart, or?
I don't think we have a clear objective. I don't think we have a strategy. Either Europe doesn't have a strategy for dealing with the various issues that I mentioned. We don't have a strategy for dealing with Europe. There are different points of view which prevail at different times. President Trump is a businessman, and he seems to approach the transatlantic relationship in terms of the cash balance sheet more than anything else. So he's concerned about, he apparently believes there's some pot of money into which everybody pays for common security interests. Well, of course, that is not how NATO works, but he's set various targets over the years. There's a second view, which is the neoconservative view, which Trump occasionally embraces. If you look at the Stoltenberg account of the meeting that Trump had, his first meeting with NATO, you'll find that he asks, well, why can't you join us in fighting North Korea? So he sees NATO as an auxiliary force for the United States. I use the word advisedly because I think of the Roman legions and the auxiliary forces they had from various barbarians who had a common interest within or could perform as mercenaries or were specialized in one way or another. For example, Syrian archers and so on. Anyway, I think this is another view. And this goes back to the mistake that Europeans and Americans made after the 90s, or during the 90s, actually. And that is a combination of triumphalism, nostalgia for the Cold War that really recreated a Cold War in Europe, a rebuff of any Russian overture on the grounds that it could not possibly be sincere, distrust, and all of the factors that led directly to both the effort to enlarge NATO militarily with the inclusion of Ukraine over Russian objections, and the rift with Russia, and the break to a point where almost nobody now, with the exception of a few Eastern Europeans, Robert Fico, Viktor Orban, talks to the Russians. And the comfortable relationship that the Finns had with Moscow earlier, where the Finnish president made a great point of being on good terms with his counterparts in Russia, is gone, as Finland has defected to the world it always belonged in, which was the West. And I think, we do need to look in the context of Ukraine at the Finnish example. Finland managed to be entirely Western in its character, but at the same time on cautious good terms with its Russian neighbor, despite having lost a lot of territory to that neighbor earlier in the 20th century. So we need to rediscover some of our own history. And part of that, as I've said before on your show, is that you can't have stability in Europe if you exclude Russia from an agreed role. You can't have stability if you exclude any great power in the European constellation from an appropriate role. We saw the consequences of that in the ostracism of Germany and the oppression of it after World War I. And we saw it again in the Cold War. So Europeans and Americans need to sit down and do a bit of common thinking rather than just using the war in Ukraine as a rallying point, which is what the Biden administration essentially did. They were almost happy about having this proxy war go on because they saw it as strengthening NATO, as you said. I, at the time, thought that the strengthening of NATO was an illusion, that it was papering over very growing differences. I think I turned out to be right about that.
Well, another thing that you write about back in 2022 is you argued very critically that it appeared that the new strategy for Ukraine, for the West, was to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. And we seem to be reaching that point. That is, this is one of the key problems for the Ukrainians, manpower problem, which is kind of runs counter to the former claims that they only lost 30,000 men, which seems a bit strange then. But also we hear similar things from Georgia now, where both the prime minister and president warned that the West has been pressuring them to become another front against Russia, and the failure to do so is why they're now having these NGOs trying to topple their government. But on this issue of fighting to the last Ukrainian, the former advisor to Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, back in 2019, he made this, I think everyone's seen it, this interview where he was arguing that, yes, well, we should have a war with Russia. This is the price we have to pay to join NATO, and we're going to win. It's going to be cool, in his words. But now, of course, forwarding to 2025, he gave an interview this week where he argued that, again, if he would become president of Ukraine, his main objective would be, well, to go to Moscow and promise to the Russians that they would not anymore allow Ukraine to pose a threat to Russia, that is, as a Western proxy. And he would have to accept some territorial concessions in order not to lose more, and restoring language rights, religious rights. And given that the Gallup polls showed that the last one I saw, 69% of Ukrainians do want immediate negotiations and end this. It appears that he represents Ukrainians much more than Mr. Zelensky. Yet, if we translate this into European, it still means we can't have any diplomacy with Russia. And now we have to send weapons, as always, but also escalate the confrontation. It's very... what I was getting to is, what do you make of the recent escalatory language on the European side? Because first we said that the Russians were scrambling von der Leyen's flight, turned out to be fake. Then we have all these drones at the airports. We all scream out, "Oh, Russians are coming, Russians are coming." But every investigation showed that there have been Germans, Chinese, some Norwegians. I mean, every nationality except the Russians, apparently. But still, the conclusion is the same. You open the newspapers here, they say, well, we have to respond to this new hybrid drone warfare. But there's no evidence. We just, it's like 0 + 0 + 0 becomes 100 in the minds here. It's very strange. And all of this eagerness to go to war seems to be happening at a time when the Americans are turning away from Europe. So we don't have the capabilities to go to war, but that doesn't appear to impact our intentions. Sort of a very long question, but what do you see as being behind the European eagerness to continue fighting this war?
Quite a number of questions, actually. Let's start with the program that Volodymyr Zelensky ran, the campaign that he ran to become president, where he had exactly the same peace mission that you're now describing. That is to say, he would go to Moscow, he would make peace with the Russians, he would revitalize the Minsk Accords, and so forth and so on, and he would accept a good neighbor policy as the basis of Ukrainian statehood. It didn't take long, about 6 weeks, I think, for him to be overwhelmed by Western Ukrainian ultranationalists of one sort or another, people who had been called neo-Nazi by everyone until they began to be the instrument to fight the Russians, at which point they were beatified and became saintly. Anyway, so we've seen this before, and the obstacle remains ultranationalism in Western Ukraine, Banderism, if you will. That is the fascist pro-Nazi legacy, anti-Russian legacy of the Ukrainian past, particularly launched in an area which was never part of the Russian Empire, but until Stalin incorporated it, namely it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or allied with Poland in some way. So this is an internal Ukrainian problem. And yes, an election of someone who rode the Gallup poll figure to victory and actually was able to pursue a policy of peacemaking with the Russians, willingness to make some concessions, as you said, is precisely how we get out of the mess that we've made. But the question that you have to ask is, what's the lifespan of someone who advocates peace in Ukraine against very determined, if minority, views? What is the lifespan of someone who goes up against MI6 and that part of the American establishment that does not agree with President Trump but wants to continue the war? So I don't know how that is resolved. But it's noteworthy that before Zelensky was turned, he had a program that's very similar to the one that's now being advocated by his opponent. So anyway, as far as now I've lost track of all the other questions that you embedded in that interesting monologue.
Well, it was the Arostovich, as you answered, goal as a president, which is very, as you correctly said, very similar to what Zelensky said back in 2019, until he was also first to reverse. But why the escalations on the European side? Obviously, a lot of the stories that are circulating in the media, which is, like the European leaders seem to be eager to respond to anything that seems like a smoking gun, that, the Russians have attacked us, now we have to do the same. It doesn't make any sense given that we don't have the capabilities to fight, but we seem to be scrambling for that intention. It's very perplexing, though.
Yeah, no, I think it's an act of desperation, really, holding on to the delusions that Ukraine can win the war, some of which we hear expressed by General Kellogg, the Trumpian envoy to Ukraine. But we hear also in we hear it in European capitals. It's frankly at this stage preposterous. And that is why I have called this the coalition of the deluded, since the delusions are apparently central to the European purpose. They are looking for every little scrap of evidence they can find to sustain them. You mentioned the explosion of drones. A lot of people suspected this was a false flag operation to re-galvanize European support for Ukraine. But I think frankly, it was just a bunch of unidentified flying objects, which were immediately construed as an alien invasion. And I don't think that deserves much credibility. So we have talk of escalation. Long-range strikes into Russia seem to be the preferred aim of this. And the problem with that is that, as Vladimir Putin said at Valdai, if I heard him correctly, this has no impact on the battlefield at all. It is, of course, it's an attack on the logistical support for that battlefield, but it's not effective because of the size and of Russian territory, the dispersal of the population, the fact that every attack deep into Russia simply reinforces the Russian determination to win the war in Ukraine. It doesn't have the opposite effect. So it is counterproductive in terms of destroying Russian morale and provoking a Russian rethinking of Russian objectives. The Russians have been very constant in their objectives. They haven't really altered them since they first enunciated them. So I think, frankly, the talk of escalation is empty talk. As you said, there's no capability. It can't solve the problem. It doesn't put effective pressure on the Russians, and it doesn't put any pressure on Ukraine, which is also needs a bit of tough love if we're going to come to a conclusion in this war.
Well, my last question is just if you see any changes coming to Europe, because you would expect that, well, in the beginning of the war, it kind of makes sense that everyone would try to unify under a common narrative. So this is a struggle of the good versus the evil. It's essentially replaying this Second World War in our heads, and Putin is cast in the role as Hitler, and Zelensky's Churchill. So it's a nice narrative to make sure that any diplomacy becomes appeasement, and you can only have peace by defeating the adversary on the battlefield. It's been the foundation of political propaganda always, but if you're losing a war or there's need to begin diplomacy, you would always expect a change in narrative. Maybe even take into account that the opponent has some security concerns which has to be addressed. And we've seen gradually one European country after another begin to fall off a little bit. So you mentioned Hungary, we have Slovakia. Poland is also getting a bit lukewarm on some of the more aggressive posturing. We had this election now in the Czech Republic where Babiš took over, and he also seems to be gravitating towards this group of countries who do not want to continue this European warmongering. But there was an article today I thought was interesting by which reported on Angela Merkel. She gave an interview to some Hungarian media where she seemingly partially at least blamed Poland and the Baltic states for the starting the war, because they had opposed the European Union having diplomacy with the Russians in 2021 at the point when Russia warned that we need a political settlement, otherwise there will be war. I mean, I'm not saying she's right in this, but it is interesting that there seems to be some shifts in narrative. Of course, all of this is happening at the same time as we're calling for more or less going to war with Russia. So it's not as if Europe is learning peace again. But what do you make of this? Do you see any change in mood, or not really?
I think there is a change in mood. You might have added Spain to the number of countries that are skeptics about all of this. But, I think I'm not sure, despite the existence of Kaya Kallas, I'm not sure that we should blame the Baltics for ideological posturing and the failure of diplomacy to engage. I spent 30 years as a diplomat. Diplomats are realists who attempt to solve problems by measures short of war. We can sometimes invoke military strength as a backing, but the basic elements of diplomacy, which involve exactly the point you made, that is some empathy for the other side, not sympathy, not agreement, but understanding of why the other side in a dispute takes the position it does, in order to be able to end the dispute or finesse it. This is something that Europeans invented, really, in the Italian city-states, and then Richelieu in France and so on, or maybe in an earlier era, Belisarius in Byzantium. But we seem to have forgotten that. We don't seem to have any ability to conduct dialogue. There's no empathy. There's no effort to produce a meeting of the minds. So the diplomacy, which should always precede war, is now treated as something that either justifies war or produces a cleanup of war, of the damage that war does. We need to rediscover diplomacy. It's not as though Europe doesn't have a very rich tradition of it, but somehow it's been set aside in favor of a kind of false militarism. I say false because, as you've repeatedly stated correctly, Europe doesn't have the capability militarily to do what it threatens to do. And we have the odd experience that, the Russians, in the person of Sergei Lavrov and a very professional senior staff in the foreign ministry in Moscow, are practicing diplomacy and capable of it, and have used it to good effect to reorient Russia away from Europe, because Europe has given Russians the cold shoulder, and toward the East, toward China, toward the South, toward India, toward the Middle East, toward West Asia, toward Africa. Europe is sort of unilaterally disarmed itself diplomatically. Very hard to understand, I agree. And I think it can't go on. And the mention of Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, one might in the EU add Ireland, Spain, and all indicates that the papering over of differences among Europeans on these issues is wearing very thin. I'm reminded of what the great investor Warren Buffett said. And he said, when the tide goes out, you can see who's swimming naked. And I think in this case, when the war subsides, we will see who is really disarmed. And I think Europeans are going to be revealed to be poseurs.
Yeah, I think the gambling everything on this war has been a huge mistake, not just the humanitarian losses and destruction in Ukraine and Russia, but for Europe, the economic decline, throwing away all political capital. It's quite.
It goes back to the question you asked at the beginning about the stability of European governments. And everywhere we see an alienation of the public from the leadership. That is to say, the people of democratic countries distrust those people whom they have elected. And they even distrust the election process now, as we've seen in places like Romania and Moldova, where there's been intense manipulation of the electoral process and a virtual veto on any result that does not align with expectations. So, and then, you see this, of course, in Germany, which it's unsustainable. The opportunity for Deutschland must be admitted to polite company. Whether you like them or not, is not the point. They represent a good chunk of the public. They should not be ignored.
And today we learned that in France, the prime minister resigned, another one after less than 1 month in power. So it's really, I think there's a legitimacy crisis among the political elites across Europe, and it's hard to argue that this is not because of the war, the economy.
We have it in the United States. As you may be aware, we have a government shutdown as a result. So this is something I think you can find everywhere. They have it in Israel. The public does not trust the political elite or the government, and with good reason.
Well, usually one will come out of, sometimes someone comes out of political crisis stronger, but in this instance, the political crisis derives from weakness. So it's very hard to see this happening this time around. Anyways, Ambassador Freeman, I already taken too much of your time. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Well, thank you for being so thoughtful.